How does the old joke go? If you can remember the 60s, you weren't really there. Maybe in San Francisco, but at the sober Detroit Economic Club, the 60s were entirely memorable. A time of sweeping social change at home and around the world. The first part of the new decade looked a lot like the old one. In 1960, the club met a man who would become one of its favorite speakers through the next quarter century. Richard M. Nixon was running for the presidency, and he spoke to the club about communism versus the free world. But it wasn't Nixon's year. The club heard from Barry Goldwater in 1964, and it wasn't his year either. 1966 brought Ronald Reagan, running for governor of California. His year was yet to come. Maybe the first rumblings of the social earthquake came when the club invited an up-and-coming newspaper columnist, Ann Landers, to speak. She warned, "The morals of our youngsters are going down, down, down." The generation gap had been officially acknowledged by the Detroit Economic Club. Racial tensions were coming to a boil around the country, and in 1967, it was Detroit's turn. The riots in July killed 43 and changed the city forever. It accelerated white flight and Detroit's transition to a majority African-American city. It elected its first black mayor, Coleman Young, a few years later. He would serve for nearly 20 years and had a testy relationship with suburban leaders, most notably L. Brooks Patterson of Oakland County. Social change was the story of the decade, and many speakers tackled it, including Walter Cronkite and Billy Graham. Graham told the crowd he'd stunned a bunch of hippies recently by telling them Jesus was a simple man with long hair and a beard. In 1969, the club hosted Senator Edward Kennedy, who was expected to run for president soon. None of the press coverage gave more than passing mention to his speech, instead dwelling on the kittenish behavior of the members' wives. A Free Press reporter wrote, "Republican women, who worried about George Romney being too far left, walked out afterward saying things like, 'My, he certainly is handsome.'" The 1960s were when the club first welcomed its most prolific speaker, Paul W. McCracken of the University of Michigan and the President's Council of Economic Advisors. He came back almost annually for 19 years. And this was the era when the club started one of its proudest traditions, speeches by American presidents. 1971 was Richard Nixon's third in-person appearance, but his first as president. The club's cultivation of up-and-coming national leaders was paying off. The appearances of astronauts from 2 different Apollo missions were among the club's most popular, as members, wives, and children lined up for autographs and photos. The Opec Oil Embargo of 1973 shocked the nation, but especially Detroit. Gas prices skyrocketed, and sales of big, thirsty cars went in the other direction. An Exxon executive told the club to get used to it. The 70s were when the club started its series of overseas study tours, 3-week trips aimed at increasing international understanding. In 1980, a delegation toured the People's Republic of China. Past President Russell Sweeney published a diary that captured the trip's many eye-opening moments. He wrote, "Our Pan Am guide said we could expect that we might see rats and bugs in our hotels. Just to be prepared, I went down to the drugstore and bought a spray can of Raid and a can of Off." In the 80s, a new era of openness followed the social upheaval of the previous 20 years. Former First Lady Betty Ford was among the first public figures to speak openly about her alcoholism. Coretta Scott King asked club members to continue the work of her late husband. But this decade was as bruising for Detroit as the last, and it ended in a crippling economic downturn. Despite the election of optimistic, pro-business Ronald Reagan, Club President Ted Mackey wrote in the Progress Report, "The Detroit metropolitan area is deep in full-fledged recession, marked by high unemployment, heavy layoffs, and plant closings. The near-term economic outlook is still not bright. The economy remains stubbornly sluggish for another 2 years." In its 50th season, the club found itself celebrating the milestone just as the city, the state, and the nation began to emerge from 4 years of deep recession. If there was anything to learn from this glimmer of light, it was this: everything is cyclical. It was a lesson that, fittingly, would be learned again in the years to come.